All right, everyone. Well, welcome to the California Oak Health Workshop. My name is Michael Jones. I am the UC Cooperative Extension Forest Advisor for Mendocino Lake and Sonoma counties. And just a couple notes before we begin. Thank you for being here and joining us this morning. This is a webinar, so you will not have access to your video or audio. If you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A chat button, which is located in your pop-down toolbar, and you can text or ask your question as a text, and we'll get back to you on that with our specialists. Also, just a reminder that this workshop is being recorded, and we will post the final video on our website with the other content. So here is the agenda. Really what we're formatting is we're trying to give kind of a structure based on the content that y'all viewed previously on our topics. We're just gonna kind of give a time format on how we're gonna address your questions. So as you can see, we'll start with woodland conservation and fire, diseases, pests, and then finish up with some wrap up and some conclusions. Myself, Carrie Winiger, and Jana Valikovic will be helping to moderate as well as presenting information. And at this point, I will pass things off to Carrie to let her do the welcome and introductions of our specialists.
Hi, everybody. My name is Carrie Winiger. Thank you, Mike. I am just so fortunate to work with both Sonoma State University's Center for Environmental Inquiry as their educational outreach lead, and also University of California Cooperative Extension, UCCE, is their Sonoma County Sudden Oak Death Program Coordinator. And we are just thrilled to have this fantastic group of experts come together to examine the topic of oak health. From several large angles that are very timely: conservation, fire, disease, pests, and to have you all join us. So I want to introduce everybody. The first topic will be oak woodland conservation and fire with Jana. If you want to introduce yourself, Jana.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jana Valikovic. I'm the forest advisor in Humboldt and Del Norte counties and been working on oak woodlands for a couple decades. I'm excited to be here.
And that topic also includes Mike, who you already heard from. Our next topic is oak diseases. First up is sudden oak death, and that's by Chris Lee. Chris, you want to introduce yourself?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Lee. I am CAL FIRE's Forest Health Specialist for the North Coast of California. I provide technical assistance concerning all sorts of forest health issues to people from the Oregon border down through about Santa Cruz County, and it is good to be here.
And then we also, in that same topic, have root rotting Phytophthora species talked about by Ted. Ted, do you want to introduce yourself?
All right, good morning, all. I'm Ted Swicki. I'm a plant pathologist at Phytosphere Research, and we've been working with oak pests and oaks ecology since about around 1980, I guess it is. So we've been around this block a few times. Be happy to contribute to this discussion.
And then our last topic is oak insect pests. And in that topic, we have Akif speaking. If you could introduce yourself, Akif.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Akif Eskalan. I'm extension plant pathologist at the Department of Plant Pathology at UC Davis. I have been working on pest and disease complexes for a while. So now I'm going to be focusing on Mediterranean oak borer and their the diseases in Northern California.
Great. Well, welcome to all the panelists and to all of the people who are attending today. Well, we had originally planned this webinar as a half-day in-person event to be presented once at UC Hopland Research and Extension Center for Mendocino County, and then again the following day at Sonoma State University's Fairfield Osborne Preserve in Sonoma County. And though we will miss that person interaction, the nature walk, and the snacks that go along with it, we are so grateful that this virtual space has allowed us to actually reach many times the number of people we'd expected to reach. And hopefully many more will see the videos and recordings of this Q&A down the line. So I do want to say this event is presented through UCCE. But we couldn't do it without our partners at CAL FIRE, Phytosphere Research, SSU Center for Environmental Inquiry, just like you heard. And as I serve two of those organizations, I just wanted to tell you briefly about what they aim to do. So UCCE is the outreach arm of UC Agriculture and Natural Resources, which envisions a thriving California, including people, food systems, and environments that are strengthened by a close partnership between the University of California and the people of the state. And you can learn more at ucanr.edu. SSU's Center for Environmental Inquiry envisions a North Bay working together to find sustainable solutions and invites you to get environmentally ready with us. Research at our 3 preserves, partner with us on environmental projects, attend public events, which there's over 24 of being held virtually this spring, and engage as a student or educator. And you can learn more at cei.sonoma.edu. So to kick it all off, I'm actually going to start by putting up a short poll for everybody. So if all the participants, I'm going to put this poll up right here. If you could please answer this question: what interested you in this workshop? Well, it looks like for some of you, this is truly just something to think about besides COVID-19. But for most of you, it seems like about 60% of you can use this information for your job. So we're so happy to have a large group of professionals here. It also, we have a large group, about 40%, that think this can help manage your own oak woodlands. And then just under that, on about 38%, 37%, it says, I'm an oak woodlands enthusiast. So great, you guys are all here for the right thing. And we're gonna jump right in because we don't have very much time today. So our very first topic is about oak woodland conservation. And before I jump into this, as Mike might have said, this is a live virtual event intended to allow time for questions and answers about the pre-recorded videos that you already watched, and they're divided by topic. And so this first topic, oak woodland conservation and fire, will bring us up to 10:30, and then at that time we'll transition to the next topic. So first up are questions on oak woodland conservation by Jana Valikovic and oak woodlands and fire by Michael Jones. So before we start getting to the questions, I'm going to start by asking some questions that people typed in advance, and that should give you guys some time to type into the Q&A box. And that is how we'll get your questions today. So if you can all start asking your questions in the Q&A box, I'm going to ask Jana a couple that we already have, and then I'll get back to the live questions. So Jana, you're highlighting some oak species that we don't hear a lot about in California, and your work was in the North Coast. So how applicable is this across different types of oak woodland systems and other areas? For example, could you give guidance to someone who works in something like an oak pine system?
Yeah, great question. So the research that I'm talking about is applicable to California black oak and Oregon white oak, which are 2 very important oak species in California's oak ecosystems. They both are deciduous oaks, which makes them a little different than some of the other oak species that California is known for, which means that they are also shade intolerant. And so they don't do very well in the shade and canopies of other species. So that makes them a little different. I believe that this work is applicable across the range of these 2 species. And in the webinar I provided, or in the recording I provided, there's some good distribution maps of where these are present. I think the real issue is if you look at our maps and you look at our vegetation classification systems, they all really originate from the first aerial photograph work that isn't available until the early 1940s. And by the early 1940s, we already have more than 100 years of adjustment in these oak ecosystems and California's ecosystems more broadly. And so I think it's easy to misinterpret those reference conditions as truly being referenced for these oak species. So I think the densification, the encroachment issue extends beyond just that of Douglas fir, which is the majority of what the work I'm presenting is on, and is applicable to pine systems and even other systems in California.
I'd like to just add a couple of points on that. We've worked a lot in blue oak systems, and blue oak, the transition wouldn't be between conifer overstory and blue oak. It's usually between blue oak and grassland when the oaks have been misfavored by cutting and grazing, or potentially into chaparral. So part of it depends where you are on the soil moisture gradient. Certainly in the wetter areas where conifers are going to have a chance to dominate, you have that issue. But when you get into the more dry areas, you have kind of a different dynamic, but you still have the potential for type change because of impacts to the existing vegetation there. So just to follow on, that it's going to be different by the oak type and how tolerant it is, and what its main competitors are and what its main threats are. But very definitely, there's similarities throughout these, but then there's clearly ecological differences.
Thank you, guys. So moving on to another question that somebody wrote in advance. Usually we're thinking about interspecies competition for oak woodland conservation. Should we also be thinking about selection of individual oaks to reestablish appropriate spacing for structure? That might be a bit more, maybe Mike?
Well, I think one of the real challenges that we have to face in this issue is this question of genetics, and what our work really points to is that the loss of these deciduous oak woodlands is happening very rapidly in our lifetimes, and it's important to think about how to preserve the genetics of these species. The individuals that are around are probably some of the ones that are more fit and can tolerate some of that encroachment better than others. So, you know, what I'm essentially suggesting is that the regeneration process of these two oak species is occurring. So they are producing viable acorns that are able to develop into young seeds, but the problem is seeds and seedlings. But the problem is that they're not advancing in size classes. So it's important to think about some of these individual trees and their retention on the landscape, because they are providing that important regeneration source. So, you know, it's kind of a both and strategy, in that we need to be thinking about how to grow more of these trees, but we also need to be thinking about what the seed source is going to come from.
And again, I'd just like to chime in. So one thing about oaks, and this kind of come up in both Mike's and Yana's talks, is that oaks don't produce a seed bank. The seed are basically viable the year that they're dropped, but once they dry out, they're non-viable. So you can have delayed emergence, but typically oaks persist as a seedling bank. Okay, so persistent seedlings. So what you're really looking at is managing the understory in terms of regeneration. So when we have fire go through and we see sprouts showing up the same year, those are burned off seedlings that are resprouting. And these sprouts, these seedlings are basically made to do that. And that's their whole point, is to sit there, wait in as what we call advanced regeneration. They're waiting for an opportunity to regenerate. So I don't think that, well, this is something that was a lot of confusion in blue oak ecology, and people were kind of concerned that they could see seedlings and big trees and they couldn't see anything in between. But if you think about the ecology of that system, there's no reason for a bunch of saplings to be growing up in the understory of mature oak woodlands. First off, they're not tolerant of understory conditions, so they really don't grow into that condition. Second, oaks stick around for potentially centuries. So you really can't have constant densification of the understory, or you would never get a 100-year-old stand. Everything would outcompete itself. So the point here is that you have to understand the ecology and the transitions that make things happen. And mostly what we're looking at in oaks is gap ecology, where when there's a gap formed, that advanced regeneration is in a position to exploit that gap. But if we don't have any advanced regeneration, it'll never exploit that gap. I'm going to just real quickly share a screen. It's not maybe the best picture for this, but it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. Share. This photo, there's two photos from the same angle here. The top one is taken in about 1888 or something like that. The bottom one was taken, oh, I don't know, whenever I did this in the 1990s or something like that, maybe around 2000. And you look at the same view, and the hills here, this is actually near Vacaville. And I guess why I point out that the land's management of this area has changed over, not that much, but it's changed over the century plus and that this taken. And you can see that there's been densification of certain areas. Some of that's chaparral, some of that's oak woodland, some of that's mixed. But you also see in this one area, we've got these clearings that basically eventually filled back in due to regen. And one of the things to remember is that in California, when kind of getting back to the old gold rush and that whole bit, when people moved here, one of the things they were doing was cutting firewood because they needed huge amounts of firewood to run their operations. That was the source of fuel. And so there was a lot of clearing that occurred right around the gold rush and for decades afterward, basically concentrated on hardwoods. So there was a lot of cutting there, and what would happen is there was a certain amount of regeneration from both stump sprouting and from advanced seedling regeneration. That is what gave rise to this forest that we're mostly seeing now. So that's just something that kind of, when you're thinking about these things, you have to kind of take a long view at the perspective to think of how these situations got to be where they were and where we go from now. Because as Jana says, this condition we have now really has nothing to do with what existed a century ago or 2 centuries ago. It's just where we ended up.
Thank you both for all that. So a couple more questions here that had already been submitted. This is interesting. What is the best way to protect oaks in a woodland construction site? How is it optimal to care for the soil and woodland trees for a certain number of years after construction is complete?
So I put in y'all's notes that a really good reference for talking about oak woodland management is to look at the Planner's Guide to Oak Woodlands and also a guide to hardwood rangeland management. They're both really excellent resources for kind of addressing some of these issues about management. But it's really important to think about, we won't spend too much time on this, but it's really important to think about the root structure of oaks. You know, it's pretty expansive. So you're going to want to give a lot of protection and a buffer around trees that protect them. So that's a really good question, and maybe something I can address with that particular attendee later, or we can direct them towards those resources.
And then one thing about the seedlings and saplings that we were just talking about, one person's wondering why Doug fir seedlings make it to that sap stage rather than the oaks. Maybe something to do with moisture?
You're right. So this is a really interesting question of which we don't have a definitive answer, but our working hypothesis is really that it has to do with deer grazing, deer browsing, that we see regeneration of Oregon white oak and California black oak where there's protection. So in a fence line, sometimes in a poison oak thicket, in blackberries. But when they're out in the open areas, they don't tend to make it to the next size classes. Our research included sites that had active cattle grazing. Half the sites had cattle grazing, half the sites did not, and there was no difference in regeneration survival between the two conditions. So I know that deer populations statewide are generally on the decline, but in the North Coast where this research took place, I don't think our resolution of the deer population data is as developed as people are aware. And so we really speculate that it has a lot more to do with this deer browse issue than anything else. There's also other forms of herbivory from small mammals and other critters that could have an impact here, but deer remain kind of our the piece that we have consistently at our sites. And if you look at the age structure data, the oak regeneration drops off precipitously in 1920, which is when the deer market program ended. So you used to be able to harvest deer deer meat for commercial sale until about 1920. And so there's coincidence, you can't say statistically with any strength, but there is coincidence between oak regeneration failures beginning in 1920 and the end of deer market availability. So that means that deer populations were on the rebound starting at that time.
Now, we only have, it looks like 5 minutes left for this section. So we have a couple more questions for Jana, but I'm going to skip to Mike. So we'll hopefully get to some of those near the end. So Mike, people are wondering about the function of dead standing trees for wildlife, from a wildlife perspective. Can you talk about like salvage versus habitat retention?
Yeah, this is actually a conversation that I had with Thomas, who's an RPF before the workshop, and he was mentioning that you know, sometimes for a landowner for post-fire restoration, they'll do harvest of dead standing hardwood for biomass production or to manage future fuels. And I think that's a really important point that I didn't really elaborate on in my talk, is that really how a landowner or land manager manages their oak woodlands before or after a fire event is entirely dependent on their goals and objectives. And so, you know, if your goal is to maybe have some financial viability, and if there's a market, harvest some of that deadwood, then by all means. What I was getting at is that, you know, oak woodlands are really diverse and important habitat structures for a lot of animals and plant life. And so in a post-fire situation, that dead biomass still provides a lot of resources. It also provides protection and structure for the regeneration of those trees. So it protects basal sprouts from extensive deer browsing, and, you know, creates some kind of canopy structure, you know, what's left of the canopy, if there is any canopy. And then really, I guess the kind of takeaway is that these systems are pretty resilient and they'll recover for the most part fairly well. And so as little disturbance as possible is to let natural regeneration is definitely a really awesome way to go. I don't know if other people have thoughts on this. It's really depends on your objectives. I think leaving it alone is probably would be my preference, but if you have other goals, then by all means approach from that perspective.
Pretty simple question. After fire, where oaks respond with epicormic growth, do the individuals ever fully recover and become healthy and viable?
Individual trees. I mean, yeah, so those sprouts through time will eventually be, they'll be vigorous resprouting initially. Through time, one or two of those sprouts will become dominant, the others will die back, and in 100 years, those will become new large oak trees that will replace what was lost. So yes, that is certainly just a really awesome way that oaks will regenerate after burning.
I'll just throw in, there are some different trajectories that also can happen. We do get a lot of wood decay fungi that are fire wound related. And so if you've got enough decay and that comes in on some of these wounds, these trees will basically fall apart instead of regenerating. So you're going to have kind of a mix, and it's going to be related to damage. And the other thing about basal sprouting is not everything that basal sprouts necessarily survives either. And part of that has to do with the genetics and among other things, part of the sprouting is related to the initial size. Generally, the larger the trees are, the less apt they are to produce basal sprouts. And one of the issues with the basal sprouts as regeneration is, compared to seedling regeneration, is that those trees established 100 years ago or more, or maybe in the last 50 years. But anyway, from 50 to 100, let's got 150. So their genetic background is to conditions that existed 100 years ago. Whereas advanced regeneration that exists now has had to recruit under current climate conditions. So in some respects, when you only go to basal sprouting of mature trees, you're setting back the evolutionary clock to whatever things were back then. So up to a point, you really do want to try to favor the new regeneration, because that is presumably adapted more to local conditions that have changed over the last 100 years.
Yeah, I'm certainly simplifying it. That's a very complex ecological system, and I'm definitely simplifying the answer. But I think we're looking at general patterns and trends here, Ted, and just kind of talking about, you know, for example, the Kincaid fire, people were really concerned and worried about what it did to the oak woodlands I live in Healdsburg and the foothills behind me. And I went out there and in some of those areas, I was, you know, not to dismiss the trauma of fire, but it's like, this is a perfect ecological burn for these systems. This is what they needed. So it's, I think really what the message I want to convey and that we're trying to get across is that these are resilient systems. And yes, there's a lot of issues, a lot of factors that determine their resiliency, but just because you have fire or some kind of disturbance doesn't mean you're going to lose that oak woodland. It has its potential and capacity to regenerate. So it'll take time though. That's the important part to remember too, is it's not going to happen quickly, right? We're looking at, you know, these trees were alive for 100 years, if not more, and it might take that long for them to come back.
I want to squeeze one more question in because it might be a little for both of you, Yana and Mike, because we have a couple people that are asking about different types of oaks and woodlands. So one person asked about advice for managing blue oak for survival of fire, climate resiliency, and mega drought, especially looking at non-native grasses on non-grazed land. And then another person's asking about blue black canyon, coast live oak, and valley oak, and in different ways to manage each type of species.
I think that question's a little bigger than my my time right now, but what I would recommend and what we're going to show at the end of this webinar is the links to the UC Oak resource page, and we've got a really amazing website, and there's this planner's guide and other oak integrated hardwood range management program materials that can help answer in specific types of oak species that, you know, can answer questions about how to do management under different oak species. So I think what we should do is push to that direction, and then maybe hold this question to the end when we can bring everybody back in once we've kind of worked through all these oak species, because there's a lot to it.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
we do have about 3 more questions, but it's time. So I think I will hold those if we have time later. So that means that we're going to be going to the next set of questions and next set of experts here. And I am not moderating that session. So I'm going to go I think it's Mike, take this one away, or is it Yana?
Yana.
I'm so sorry. Yana. So go
No
ahead and take away the next section here.
All right, thanks, Carrie. Thanks for the handoff. Well, that was a great discussion, and you can see that this is a really talented audience to be able to work through a lot of these issues. So our next focus is really on oak diseases, and the 2 presenters gave us some information about the introduced invasive plant pathogen known as sudden oak death, which is a Phytophthora, by Chris Lee. And so Chris, welcome. And then Ted Zwicky gave us a really in-depth set of talks around Phytophthora in general and how they're doing a number of things to our native vegetation throughout California. So again, we're focusing in on plant pathogens that are introduced and invasive, and I think through Ted's videos in particular, we've really got a sense of the enormity of the challenge and kind of this interrelationship between restoration planting as well as the planting of a variety of cultivars for beauty and aesthetics around our homes, and kind of the way that these pathogens can kind of sneak around and get, you know, and hitchhike in on these potted plants that we are putting out in the native environment. So to kick it off, I guess I'd like to ask both of you, and maybe I'll start with Chris first to bring your voice into the equation. What do we know about the nursery industry, and how as consumers can we make wise decisions about plant propagation and planting of desirable species, whether they be native or cultivated species? You know, what advice can you offer us in this world, given that there are these hitchhiking pathogens that seem to creep around?
I mean, to be honest, I think I should defer to Ted.
Chris, you're cutting out a little bit here. Chris, we've lost your video, your audio. So maybe I'll bunch over to Ted here.
Okay.
Ted, you want to take it away?
Sure. So this is the problem. We're in a real mess relative to that, and that's what I was trying to communicate in this talk. And the fact is, for the last half century plus, nurseries have been really loaded with Phytophthora, and they continue to get more and more Phytophthora. A lot of global trade tend to spread these species around globally very quickly. There was one species Niederhauserii, that was going to be described by scientists in about 3 different continents, and all at the same time, because it all appeared at the same time, and it all came from nursery trade. So it's problematic. The bottom line is, right now, if I go down to the nursery, a commercial nursery, and try to buy some material, I've got a good likelihood that it's Phytophthora infected. Not every single plant will be infected, but it's going to be a high percentage. And it's problematic. So the best we can do so far right now is, for these super critical situations, which are our restoration, we've got this clean stock production system, a set of BMPs that work for that, and an accreditation system that's been put in place and it's been tested for several years now, which is quite effective. We've had thousands and thousands of plants tested with no detections when nurseries follow these practices. The problem is, it's so much different than what the normal nursery industry does in terms of its management of plants in nurseries, that we don't see it coming down the pike very, very soon for anybody else. That's the problem. It's a little intractable. We're working with CDFA a little bit on this, but basically the nurseries don't want to do it. They don't consider it to be their problem. And it's the consumers who don't see this disease in the plants, because the plants can look really good, that are basically putting it into their yards and letting it propagate there. They're the ones who are being harmed, and they don't have a way to really deal with it. So it's not a great situation right now. It's stuck there.
Right, super complicated. I mean, it seems like a lot of the work of the California Oak Mortality Task Force has been on educating the nursery industry, and there's been a lot of effort to really try and improve overall sanitation practices. And I mean, isn't there some good news in this, that there's new awareness to these issues, and it's highlighting ways that will, whether it's for Phytophthora in general or for other plant pathogens, that we may see some improvement in the nursery industry. And Chris, do you want to try your audio again, see if that works now?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry, I kind of missed a lot of Ted's answer because I was trying to figure out what was going on with the audio. Can you still hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. And so I don't know if what I had to say was going to sort of contradict what Ted had to say or complement it. Did you guys talk about the difference between commercial and restoration nurseries?
Yeah,
so
to
much.
a point. I mean, well, yeah. I mean,
There's a message out there, or there's a danger, I feel, that because some of these problems have come from restoration plantings, there is a bit of a danger that we might tend to think of restoration nurseries as sort of guilty villains. I do think that they're a separate sector in many ways from commercial and retail nurseries, and so there are a lot of complexities to the topic that we don't want to oversimplify. So that was one of the things I wanted to point out, is that a lot of people are trying to do good work with restoration.
Shoot. Well, there goes Chris's audio again.
well, let me just follow up on this a little bit. So, right, and as I mentioned in my video, the problem has been that there's been no real separation between between the Phytophthora flow between commercial nurseries and restoration nurseries.
But people like you, Ted, are helping them work on this problem, right? So
right. And that's kind of where we're going to now, is that enough of the restoration nurseries that are working with the Phytophthora working group of the COMTF are really pitching in on this. They're interested in trying to produce clean stock. They're following these guidelines are quite successful. I mean, basically they show it can be done. It can be done at a reasonable price. One thing about restoration stock in general, it's a small size material. Mostly you clear it through in a year. So it's planted earlier in the year, it's planted out in fall into the field. And the reduced residence time in the nursery also helps you kind of minimize the risk in that respect. So if you've got bigger stock that's sitting around for years in the nursery, you have to be much more careful to avoid contamination. And so people in their yards like to use bigger stock. And so that makes it even more difficult to produce clean stock for that kind of sector, because you have to even be more fastidious on that. But the bottom line is there's progress being made, and definitely within the restoration sector that can be done. And the point is, if any other nursery wanted to adopt clean practices, they could. They will have to sell their plants at a premium. And the problem is, for them to do that, there have to be consumers that are willing to buy clean plants at a premium. If that market exists, people will fill that niche. But as long as people look for the cheapest plant and say, it's all the same to me, then there's no incentive by a nursery to produce plants that might cost 50% more or twice as much, even if they are disease-free relative to Phytophthora. So it's partly a market issue, that you have to have market awareness. Within the restoration industry, the market awareness is there. People understand they do not want to corrupt their restoration sites by introducing pathogens. So they're willing to pay a premium, and really it's cheaper in the long run by many, many folds compared to trying to mitigate an infested site. So that's kind of where we stand in terms of the bigger picture.
Okay.
I
want to.
Can I mention just one more thing? Just one more thing.
Okay.
There is also a wider political dimension, and getting more informed on what's going on with trade between the U.S. and the rest of the world as it applies to pathogenic organisms is something that everybody can do, and then talk to your elected officials about it.
Right. I mean, the parallels to COVID in some ways are quite interesting, actually, thinking about what our societal choices are. We have about, 10 more minutes. And so I just want to make sure we get through a couple of the questions. So I'm going to throw out two of them here. There's a question about commercial compost and whether it's also a potential contributor. And I guess where I'd like to get at is, what are our restoration options where we've got these introductions, especially these soil phytophtheras? What can we do in those sites? And is there anything that's available? So two questions. I don't know which of you wants to take. The first one would be about compost, and then let's sort of talk about restoration once we've got these pathogens in the wildland.
Let me address compost, and then I'll have Ted talk about Phytophthora in restoration, if that's okay. Because the compost question is sort of straightforward. These pathogens can survive in compost if it has not been prepared according to the standards that are set out by one of our state government agencies, which is Cal Recycle. And composting facilities can find out what those standards are and abide by them. If it hasn't been
Chris, we've lost you again.
Let me just follow up on that. So he's correct that the composting standard, if compost is heated to the temperatures that are part of the composting standards, it will be free of Phytophthora contamination. However, there are no standards for requiring that you use clean equipment to handle finished compost, and you don't have potential for contaminating it. The contamination protocols for compost are really looking at human pathogens, E. coli and things like that. And so they don't really consider these kind of small bits of contamination to be significant. And they may not be significant for E. coli, but they are significant for Phytophthora, because if you have a small amount of contamination and you spread it out somewhere and there's host plants, that's all it takes to get an infection. So the problem is, if you have a composting system that's, for instance, like in-vessel composting, where it's completely contained and then they can put it into clean equipment and transport it, it's set to go. The good, finished, proper compost also tends to have a low pathogen load, but it can still be contaminated because there aren't these safeguards for minimizing the cross-contamination after the material's been finished.
Okay, well, and there's another related question to this, which is about cleaning equipment and what is the strategy around cleaning equipment. And I'm going to take this one just for a minute because I've been working on this issue specifically. And what's impressive actually is that our preliminary research on chainsaws shows that we don't get in contamination of the chainsaw over time. And it is probably a combination of the heat as well as the bar oil, which breaks apart the cell structures for the pathogen. So we're feeling less concerned about chainsaws. The bigger issue is when you're dealing with equipment that picks up a lot of debris and soil on it. And so our work is suggesting really that getting that material off the equipment is what is important. And the addition of a sterilizer may be beneficial, but may be hard to accomplish. So what we've seen is that the use of an air compressor is really effective in decontaminating large pieces of equipment, and is a rather achievable piece of equipment to bring into the woods or into the field setting that in your situation. We're going to clearly have more questions here today than we can answer, but I'd like to bring it back to this question about kind of what do we do in these sites once we've got an infestation. So Ted, would you mind helping us think through this issue of, you know, you showed examples where Phytophthora cinnamomum is established and you get these infection centers which continue to grow. You know, what does the future look like in those sands, and is there something we can do?
Yeah, so the issue is once you've got a widespread infestation, you're pretty much out of luck. All you can do is avoid further spread. So what you're looking at in it is trying to contain it by avoiding things like wet trail use and soil grading and things like that that move the pathogen further, because once you get to that size, it's pretty intractable. I'll put a quick screen share up here for a couple of slides.
And we're getting tight on time, Ted. So
Yeah. But basically, just to show that under conditions where we've got limited infestations, we can do, and we have successfully used spot solarization. We've solarized these spots, heated them sufficiently. If they get to the right temperature ranges, you can basically bake that Phytophthora back out of the soil. The problem is if you don't have enough sun, you can't get it hot enough at depth. And at remote sites where it's been difficult to get that kind of temperature, we've actually had to go to using solar ovens. We basically excavate those sites and cook them in a solar oven. And we get temperatures in these solar ovens that's high enough to pasteurize this soil. The options in infested landscapes are much more limited. You can use phosphites, and we have treated, this is Island Manzanita picture. Because of the overlay, it's not showing the background picture. Oh, here it is. But basically, we treated this is it in this non-treated form. This is it afterwards. And you can see that basically, by treating it on a 2-year basis, we're able to hold the line, essentially. So we can potentially hold borders here and there, but that's fairly intensive. You've got to treat every couple of years. In certain areas where there's very limited resources and you're just trying to buy some time, that's a possibility. But the bottom line is you don't want to introduce it because all the options after that become much more difficult.
If you can hear me, can I add one thing?
Yes, please.
Well, in Australia, they've dealt with widespread Phytophthora cinnamomi infestations for decades and decades. And there are many places where it's the situation where Ted's talking about, where it's so widespread that nothing can really be done at this point. There are also places where some surprising players, like the aluminum mining industry, for example, were able to get together and coordinate efforts in a really wide-scale way, and it involved mapping infested areas, and it involved controlling access to the areas and making sure that equipment was washed and sanitized, things like that, when they entered and exited the areas. It took a lot of effort. There's also been a really big outreach and education effort there in Australia as well. But they have been able to make some headway in areas of Australia using that kind of really large-scale coordination. Obviously, that's really difficult to do and takes a lot of sort of political synchrony that isn't always available.
But that's also slow to
Right.
spread. It doesn't really deal with the existing infestations. What's infested remains infested. But what you're
Sure.
trying to do there is keep from infesting even wider areas.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, I can sense that we're scratching the surface with the questions that are here, and the audience is really putting out some great questions. So we're at 10:50, so we're going to switch to the insect portion, and then we're going to come back together for some cross-cutting questions at the end. And so hopefully we'll be able to pick up some of the ones that we're not answering at that time. And Mike and I are trying to figure out a strategy how to make sure we get some answers to the great questions that are coming forward. So have patience with us, please, and keep posting them to the question and answer session. We'll figure out some strategy. So thank you, Ted and Chris. That was really informative and interesting to think about the bigger political ramifications and how you work from the international to the national to the local level, and how we start to think about where the role of the consumer is in this, and what you can do at the site level once you have an infestation. So thank you very much, and I think I will turn it over to Mike now.
All right, thanks, Yana. So I'm going to moderate this section. We're talking about oak insects. Particularly, we're focusing on the newly detected invasive Mediterranean oak borer. So I've been working on this insect as well. Akif has been a key collaborator and one of the key researchers working on understanding the disease and insect complex. So we have lots of questions, and we're still trying to figure things out. Currently, we're establishing a research project as Keith mentioned in his talk, to kind of understand the distribution, dispersal, and trapping methodology for this insect. I guess, Keith, is there any thoughts you had, any new kind of development, understanding the pathogenicity of these fungal symbionts and kind of what maybe that impact would be? One of the really important questions we have right now is, do the fungi that this insect that it inoculates these trees with, could it possibly kill healthy trees, right? We don't really understand if it's just attacking stress trees, but is there a potential for it to potentially get into healthy trees and cause some damage?
So we still, thank you, Mike, for the introduction. So we still don't know if these pathogens that we recovered from these infested wood and also from the beetle are pathogen. Well, we are guessing that they might be pathogen based on the symptoms that we have been seeing on the plants. During my presentation, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. Some of the symptoms in the woody part of the plant is so the black and then discolored. So apparently, either pathogen itself or fungus itself is causing those discolorations, or those are the tree response. That the tree is responding so much, and then that's also eventually causing the death of the plant. So as we speak, we are right now running a pathogenicity test with the fungal species that we recovered from these the diseases. And then we will soon are going to find out if these fungi are pathogen, if they are, how aggressive they are. So we will get that answer soon.
Yeah, this is a really interesting complex. Looking at these ambrosia beetles and their symbiotic fungi. One thing, I know this is jumping ahead of the gun on the research, but one thing I was wondering that I was thinking about, the other day was, the bark beetles, they can sometimes pick up, they just pick up, what do you want to call it? Pathogens, not even pathogens, but fungi or different types of organisms on the tree. They just hitchhike a ride on the bark beetles. And sometimes that means, it's a way they can vector a fungus or some kind of agent that becomes a pathogen. And I'm wondering if we can see the same thing happen here. So for example, we have foamy bark canker that the western oak beetle vectors. It's a Geosmithia. So I was wondering, is there a possibility or potential in the future for this insect? Maybe it turns out that the fungi, its symbionts, aren't very pathogenic and we're seeing like a hyperactive response by the tree, but is there a potential for it to pick up some native fungi that could be pathogenic that they're spreading around and might have maybe even more different or worse or kind of synergistic impacts on these valley oaks and some of these other tree oak species?
That's very good point, Mike. We have seen these phenomenon in other pest and disease complexes. Yes, these are very small little beetles, which when you look at these beetles under the scanning electron microscope, you can see they have a lot of hairy bodies. So which means when they are establishing their galleries on the plant, so when the new generation comes out, so they are probably contaminated with whatever they have on their body without intentionally. And then when they bore a new the galleries, they unintentionally introduce those pathogens. But we also know some of these fungi that we recovered are specifically associated with the beetles that they have known to be associated. So when we are recovering these, identifying the fungal issues, we didn't only make the isolation from the wood, we also make isolation from their head or mycangia to make sure these fungi are intentionally being transmitted. For example, the fungal species that I mentioned in my talk, I don't think all of them are being carried by their mycangia. Some of those Paracelomycete group of the fungi might be transmitted by contamination. We still don't know that part yet, but we will soon get an idea.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting too that the more we are out in the field observing this insect, it seems like we find it on more different hosts. We definitely aren't sure of how successfully it can attack different species of tree. The literature from Europe suggests that there's a pretty good host range. Can we expect the range, the host range to expand? Are we looking at maybe it's just valley oaks or what appear to be susceptible because they're already stressed, but we see it in blue oaks? I mean, what are we looking at for potential impact across different types of oak woodlands, right? It's very limited on our knowledge, but can you speculate or do you have any ideas maybe what we might see as we learn more about this insect?
Sure. So apparently this beetle is an invasive beetle to California. Now we know based on their molecular identification, they are originally coming from Mediterranean basin. They have been established in that Mediterranean basin for a long time. As you mentioned that in Mediterranean basin, we know that they also attack several different host species. So I'm expecting that they are going to be attacking or the current oak species that they have been attacking in Mediterranean basin. In the meantime, this is a new land for invasive pests. It's like the kind of things for the invasive beetle. When they come to the new land, they may have more variety of the oaks that they haven't been or seen before when their native range. So there is a possibility that they may expand the number of the oak species that they may cause. So the answering this question is, when you ask this question, the beetle, I'm sure they don't even know how many oak species that they're gonna go. So they are in the new land and then the new opportunities we are gonna see by the time. But there is a potential that they may increase that number of the species.
Yeah, one thing I'm really interested to see is, in Europe, in the Mediterranean, one of their primary or favorite hosts, if you will, is cork oak. And, there's a lot of that planted ornamentally. The Napa Valley is kind of its epicenter, the northern Napa Valley. And in those areas, has some cork oak growing randomly around Healdsburg where I live. I'm really interested to see, if it becomes an issue in these trees. I mean, is there enough of a divergence in coevolution that the trees are susceptible, that they're going to have a different response if they become infested? I'm really interested to see how this beetle interacts with its known host in an, essentially an invaded range. So there's lots of really interesting ecological questions to still be looked at. Well, everybody seems to know everything about the insects, so we don't have any questions on the beetle. Do any of our other panelists have any thoughts or anything that they want to talk about while we're here? Like I said, we've only really studied this insect for a very short period of time, and so we're still learning a lot about it. One thing I do want to point out that I just thought of is, Keith showed their flight periodicity, when we can expect emergence, and it shows this kind of seasonality where you get maybe a winter period and then peak emergence occurs in the early summer. I just want to point out that when we were trapping, I was picking up adults whenever it was above freezing. When it was 50, 60 degrees out, they were flying. Whether that means they're viable reproductively or they can attack new hosts, we're not sure. But boy, that's pretty crazy to think that there may not really be a period of flight inactivity if they're pretty active year round. So this is going to have some serious implications on management in some of these oak woodland systems.
That's correct. So we know a little bit more information about the other Ambrosia beetle complex, which is invasive shuttle borer complex that we also have been working in Southern California. That these kind of beetle, they primarily colonizes in the woody tissue. So if you think about that, there's a thick bark, and then they go to the woody part of the plant. So inside the woody part, it doesn't matter how much the temperature outside, there's a moderate temperature within the wood tissue. We know that they are alive during the winter, cold weather and everything. The only thing that will affect them is that the temperature that outside that may not risk their life. So if I have to give you an example, that in invasive shuttle borer, they prefer the temperature of 68 and above for flying and then looking for the new host. We don't have such study and results from this beetle so far, but I'm guessing that they will prefer a little bit warmer weather. When you look at the California weather, so we have a lot of microclimate all over the places. So wherever they find the infested area, so that flight emergence may change from location to location.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see after we have multiple years of trapping data to really understand their flight patterns and when we're getting significant activity and how that correlates to maybe new infections or dispersal and spread. We had a comment about how the beetles take advantage of fire. And Akif, I don't know if you know the answer to this. I'm speculating that in the literature, it suggests that you really see a lot of activity from Mediterranean oak borer in areas where oaks have been impacted by fire. I suppose that's because they're stressed and more vulnerable. I don't know if there's a mechanism of attraction where the beetles are, there's a group of flat-headed borers called Melanophila. They're attracted to heat and fire damage. I don't know if these ambrosia beetles in particular are attracted to that kind of cue, but I think they're taking advantage of stressed trees. I don't know, Keith, have you seen anything different in fire damage versus just stress trees?
That's a very good point. So as you mentioned that these beetles are known to attack and colonize stress plants. So when it comes to stress plants, the stress plants produce more ethanol in the environment where they can be identified by these beetles. So when you look at our trapping system is that we also use high release ethanol for these beetles, which are attracted to. So I'm guessing that in the fire damage plants, they might be also called the stress plants. Mm-hmm. They might be also they're releasing some kind of the odor or ethanol based the things that they could attract them. So other than I have no idea if the temperature or heat of itself will attract these beetles. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think where we're seeing the current infestation is really kind of on the edge of the Kincaid fire. It's also kind of on the edge of the 2017 fires. And so it'll be really interesting to see with this research if we see some kind of correlation with these fire footprints. But right now it's showing up in a lot of areas where the trees themselves are just stressed, maybe from legacy drought issues. And like Akif said, they're just attracted generally to basically stress signs and kind of stress indications. But we're gonna learn. We'll find out. Somebody did ask if we have a picture of the beetles in your talk, Akif. At the very beginning, you show a picture. I think you mentioned the females like the size of a sesame seed, so they're tiny. They're really, really small. They're pretty cool little gals. They're really interesting to study. And I should point out we're working on a pest alert, which we should have published soon. There you go. So yeah, don't let that blow up fool you. They're pretty small. And then the males are even smaller. Maybe we should, Keith, we should talk about kind of, there you go. The reproductive strategy of these beetles. I mean, it's kind of a little bit of a fun thing to talk about because they're so crazy.
Sure. Okay. Am I muted? No. Okay. So these ambrosia beetles has a very interesting lifestyle. So we haven't specifically studied on this beetle, but we know the lifestyle from the other ambrosia beetle very close related to these species. So they reproduce within the galleries, and then female is the one that can decide how many males or how many females she would like to produce within the galleries. That these information are that we know from the invasive shuttle borer as well. So so most of the time the daughter, or let me say, they do the sibling mating within the gallery. And then when the adult female comes out from the galleries, they are mated, and then they are ready to make their own the infestation and generation in that area. So they have a very interesting and in their perspective protective lifestyle. When we look at these history of these ambrosia beetles, they have been survived for more than millions and millions of years. Imagine what happened on the earth for last couple millions years that they were able to survive whatever it happened on the earth during that season. So they have a very protective and then safe reproduction system that they established. It's very interesting. And then let me put it one way. One single beetle could, usually female is the one that make the galleries, home and everything. The male just only the work as a mating partner. He doesn't even like the flight effectiveness and everything. But female is the one that make the new galleries. They have the mycangia where they can carry the fungal species, and then they could just run the show themselves.
Yeah, this is definitely one of those, well, a lot of insects are like this, but the females run the show. The males have a very limited role in the life cycle. All right. well, that's kind of the end of the oak insect section, talking about Mediterranean oak borer. Like I mentioned, we're still really early in the research on this particular pest, and we'll have more information available soon as we get a pest alert put together and Akif and others continuing the research project. So while we've been talking, Yana has been diligently going through your Q&As and trying to determine if we answered it live or if we're going to respond later. And so now let me pull back up. So now we're going to go ahead.
I was going to say, I'm not entirely sure that everyone can see the answers, but I'm hopeful they can. And please bear with us. We're not used to putting programs together in this virtual space. We're much better at making coffee and serving cookies and running a slide projector than we are working in this space. But if you look at your question and answer box and you expand it a little bit, at the top of it there are open questions, answered questions, and dismissed questions. The dismissed ones would be ones that we've been able to answer live in the session here. So maybe some folks in the chat can tell me if they can do that. Oh, good. I see answers in the chat are visible.
Yep.
So it should be answers in the question and answer session. So we're trying to get there. But now I'll turn it back to you because we want to do some cross-cutting discussion here across all these issues.
Yeah, so kind of how I'd like to wrap this up is I know there's lots of questions and we've only just piqued people's interest in a lot of these subjects, but I'd like to take a step back and kind of what we call like that 30,000 foot landscape level view and talk about, kind of oak issues at that landscape level. Yana, I really like, can you start us off? Because I really love your kind of Mr. Rogers view of oak woodlands and the really tough issue of climate change and kind of dealing with that.
Yeah, well, it gets a little bit to the metaphysical, how do you state a little bit in that, I mean, I think we're probably all facing this in the cabin fever that we have with COVID and, is there an end in sight? And, how do you put these pieces together and sort of rectify that? We've got pathogens that are moving around. We've got, loss of natural and periodic fire, which is, creating substantial changes in our landscape. And that is making, the landscape more susceptible in some ways to other issues. We've got hitchhikers and, and then we've got this big issue of climate change and is that the new normal? And, how do we make sense of all this? And, I will admit that I'm more of a glass half full kind of person. And though I feel like I've been a little half empty lately with COVID, but, when you look at these issues and you look at the larger landscape view, I think it can feel really overwhelming in the same way that trying to manage climate change can feel really overwhelming. It's this big outer force that that is, putting and exerting pressure down on us. And, as an individual, how do you make a difference? And, I think we have to remember that it really depends on our goals and working at scales that we can manage. And, I am a rural property owner, like I imagine that many of you are who are participating today. And so, I think it's really about putting our tools back in our toolbox, recognizing that we can make a difference for individual trees, for groves of trees. And, as we start patching together those individual collective actions, we make a substantial difference for the outcome of oak species in California. And so it's about, becoming clear about what your goals are and what tools you need to implement those goals and being able to evaluate success and adapt when you try something and it doesn't always produce the outcome you're hoping for. We're gaining a lot of interest, for example, in prescribed fire. I see some questions in the chat specifically about prescribed fire, and we're bringing that tool back to the land owning community to be able to have it be a more viable option for land management, which is going to be really important for a number of the issues that we're talking about and will help the overall survival and resilience of these oak stands. So, I guess, just to try and wrap it up, Mike, in that way, that, I think when I look at the actions that individuals can take, I get inspired. And if we can collectively band those pieces together, I think, together we can make a real difference on the landscape of California, on the resilience of California, and on the ability for these oaks to persist, at least in their genetics, through time.
That was awesome. Fantastic. Anybody else want to add to that? I know it's a tough act to follow up, but I think this is really important. It's sometimes when we get stuck in the moment, it's a little bit doom and gloom, and it's really important to remember that, we're not set in stone here, right? We can work together to kind of help these systems persist and change our perspective of how we manage and what we think about management.
Well, I might add just that some of these systems, it helps to, Ted pointed out earlier, it's really important to just know about the ecology of them. And a lot of the systems that we're worried about because of pathogens, insects, lack of fire, things like that, these are systems that are dynamic, and a lot of them got reset to earlier successional stages by disturbances like fire. And sometimes the best way to think about how to have an effect on the landscape is really to think about just working with it, doing something on it, and not in terms of finding a quick fix like a chemical that you can put here and there. And that takes a lot of experimentation. And some of these problems, like a lack of fire or phytophthora in the soil or other invasive species that have been brought into the state, do seem somewhat permanent in some ways. They're going to be here for the long haul. So landscapes may not go back exactly how they were 100 or 200 years ago, but by trying to work with the landscape in a mindful way and thinking about what the goals are and what the ecology is, just getting out there and doing things and then sharing that knowledge, maybe we can figure out how to adapt to some of these issues.
Yeah, that's great. A question came up that I thought was pretty interesting, and just kind of a little anecdotal story. I worked on emerald ash borer for grad school in the East Coast, and that's a really serious invasive insect, and we're looking at essentially a functional extinction of ash from the landscape. And so it's kind of a really pretty significant challenge, right? It's not the first. First we had the chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease. Now we're just moving on. So for our local example of sudden oak death, somebody point out that, their tan oak are dying back. But it's this long-term vision. Do we see tan oak being able to survive and evolve or become adapted to sod? Do we see that ever becoming, kind of a component of the forest again, where there's some genetic diversity in the population that some trees survive? Or are we looking at a functional extinction, or what's your kind of theory on this going into the future?
Well, I'll just start out. I mean, there have been studies on resistance in tan oak, and there does seem to be some out there. So from a standpoint of general forest pathology genetics, as long as we have some resistance to work with, and it can be expressed long enough to get the trees to reproductive size, eventually the forest will convert over to a more resistant genotype. And so, chestnut is an issue where it still exists as sprouts and stuff because it can't get to these larger sizes without dying back. And that's a possibility for tan oak if we don't have some resistance in the population. But the other thing is that not everything has the same inoculum pressure. And once we lose the overstory, I guess the question really gets to be how do we change the dynamics of cycling of Phytophthora aurorum in those ecosystems without the overstory and the microclimate and everything else that's changed there. So it's probably going to morph as you lose the entire tan oak overstory. You still do see blighting in shoots of seedlings, but maybe that's not enough to produce enough inoculum to kill those seedlings until some later point. But it may be enough to select for greater resistance. And so, a century later, we may have more tolerant, more resistant tan oaks in these forests.
To answer this question from Inverness, I think that the thing to think about in the near term, where these infestations of sudden oak death are most developed and established, I think tan oak as an acorn producing tall shade tree is going to have a lot of trouble. But in most cases, the burl will sprout, and so the genetics will persist on the site. If conditions can change at some point that'll allow those sprouting individual stems to mature, then I think the tan oak will come back as an acorn producer in those sites. But in the near term, we haven't really seen that. We see that tan oak basically moves from a tree more towards a shrub or mid-story form in these stands. There are other, tree species that are taking the light and taking advantage of that reduction in canopy from the tan oak trees. And it is, I will not deny, it is an awkward adjustment period. And so, I'm optimistic, just like when you look at sugar pine. I mean, you'll still see sugar pine in the North Coast in pockets and in places that were isolated from the wind currents that moved around the blight that was killing sugar pine. So, when you scale up, I think tan oak will still be a part of the landscape. It probably won't be as dominant as it is in so much of its range in California, at least for quite a while, until we can catch up in the ways that Ted was talking about with, improved genetics or, finding a resistant individual. The good news is that we've got a lot more tools than we did when it came around to sugar pine or Porterford cedar. And so, we're on a more accelerated path to try and find some of that resistance. But there's going to be a period of discomfort, I think, until that stuff can catch up. Either the evolution of the tan oak genomics or our ability to find that resistance can catch up.
Just really quickly, I also think that over the long term, what happens with the local climate is going to be very important. Because in California, I don't think we know where the climate breaking points are going to be. In some areas, the future may be warmer and wetter. In others, it may be warmer and drier. And if the locality gets warmer and drier, it could be that sudden oak death loosens its pressure on tan oaks in the area. If it's warmer and wetter, it could be the opposite. So a lot will depend on that.
Yeah, I think we've mentioned this a few times. Everyone's talked about it, but it's important to remember we're like a snapshot in time, right? In the scale of the grand scale of things, what happens now, is really important. But we got to look at the long-term patterns and the ecological resilience of these systems. So it's important to remember that we have a big impact and we can influence the future of these systems, but they've been persisting for a long time, and typically they'll find a way. It might look different, but they'll survive. All right, so we're approaching the end of our official stop time. So before people have to go, I would just like to mention a couple things. We've had a few questions about resources, and I'm assuming that a lot of that has to do with actually doing management. And so we have a lot of information posted on our website, but there are some cost share programs to help get this work done. You can work with a professional forester. There's funding through CAL FIRE from the NRCS. And we have a lot of programs. Yana, is there anything you want to add to this? I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on this because it's all laid out in a nice format, but there is stuff out there to help people, and we're trying to make it so that landowners of any size can get this really crucial management work kind of started.
Yeah, maybe I'll just add just a couple of pieces to this. That all the types of assistance programs that are out there that are both come from the state, the feds, and sometimes through nonprofit organizations really stem from the idea of having a good management plan and having an idea of where you want to go. So it doesn't matter what interests you in management. It doesn't need to be commercial in any orientation. It's really about your goals, your family objectives, and how to achieve those. So I recommend for folks that are, working through these challenges, thinking about these oak health issues, that you do connect with a professional forester and then connect with some of these assistance programs to try and help, patch it together and figure out where you want to go and what would be helpful in the near term and the long term. So there's funding that comes from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, which is a USDA Department of Agriculture program. There's funding that can also come from the Partners program, which is with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's also funds that come from CAL FIRE through the California Forest Improvement Program. The Vegetation Management Program can also be a tool for implementation of prescribed burns, if that's part of your management strategy. And then we're also seeing new dollars come available that are originally coming from CAL FIRE and the Greenhouse Gas Program, but they're being distributed through resource conservation districts, through other, associations and groups that are working together. And so there's a lot of different ways to kind of patch this together. And, there's this other question here about land management associations and is there assistance for that? I don't see much in relation to the planning part and pulling the association together, but if the association can develop a strategy, there are funds available that can help them implement that strategy more than like the dollars that can support the group coming together. So we're in a good time where, health and oak health, California's health, carbon is really something that's a hot topic. And so it's a good time to engage because there are more resources now than I've seen probably in the last 15 years. So, and we're all here to help. So just let us know if we can.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned, we're at the end of our official time. I think if our panelists are willing, maybe we can stick around for a couple more minutes and address some of those questions we didn't get to. But before we do, and before people need to go on and do their other things, we'd like to launch another poll just to ask you what you thought about the format of this workshop. This is new for us, so this was an experiment. Thank you all for being our guinea pigs, our test subjects. We really kind of weren't sure how this is going to play out. So we would like to hear some feedback, and I'm going to show you this poll, and it'd be great if you could kind of let us know how you thought this went. So we appreciate it. It'll help us next time if there's anything you didn't like.
Especially since we don't know how long these COVID restrictions will continue. So we're strategizing and trying to be adaptive. We've got a whole lot more workshops coming, really even in the next week. So we're in a brave new world for us trying to navigate through using these online tools. And both this one and the one next week, for example, were all designed to be in-person events. So didn't quite want to take them and make it a long seminar series where we were doing live watching live presentations, because like in this case we would have been 5 hours online plus question and answer. That seems like a lot, but we're for future ones where they're not developed yet, that might be a better strategy.
Yeah, and we're learning, so bear with us. We'll get it. We'll get you.
And Mike, if I can just add in real quick, I'm happy to get any feedback that people have about ideas or what they think did work. If you have more than just a button on a poll you want to push, feel free and send me an email. It's also really good to get feedback to know what the community is finding valuable, to know what to produce and how to show support for our program. So anything, you can even say it in the chat window if you have more to say than just that poll button.
Yeah, well, I'm going to end the polling. We have pretty good turnout, and I'll just show you all what we got here. Most of you are happy. Good, thank you. I appreciate that. So I guess, is there anything that any of our panelists want to go back and address with the little bit of time that we have? I figure we can maybe do a couple more minutes and try to address some of those questions that we briefed over, or that maybe we didn't get to.
Well, I'm happy to answer this one on prescribed fire if someone would like it.
Sure, yeah, there's a
it
few
came
on
back
that.
twice there. And so next week we're actually doing a program on prescribed fire. So there's some synergy between this and that next one. And just recognize prescribed fire is an important tool in your land management toolbox. And it has to be thoughtfully applied, and there has to be a very conscious effort to understand about the potential proximity or the co-occurrence of invasive species such as Himalaya blackberry or French broom or Scotch broom. So when you're thinking about using that tool, you have to be thinking about the future stand conditions and whether or not you're creating a pathway for those plants to come in and how to strategize to address that if there is some acceleration of the establishment of those individuals. So the answer I put in the chat box or the question and answer session was really to approach it from an integrated pest management strategy, understand sort of the reproductive challenges that each of those plants have, and think about how to frame your management approach to, you know, sort of decouple that reproductive potential of those invasive plants. So, you know, it takes a layered and nested approach.
Yeah. You know, one thing I'd like kind of maybe a lot of the things we talked about, aside from the woodland conservation and fire, is these are invasive species. So what's our future look like? You know, I can give it away right now, right, with this kind of international global trade network we have, maybe not with COVID right now, but in general, we're looking at this ever increasing number of invasive species being introduced to North America. And so maybe you guys, if you wanted to maybe surmise or take a guess at what can we expect? Are we in store for more phytophthora, sudden oak death type phytophthora, more invasive beetles, more pest pressures on our oak woodlands? Where are we heading?
I'd like to take a little stab at it. Actually, I think the idea with the COVID is not a bad thing to consider. And right now, international trade has gone into the dumper, right? And so there's not a lot of stuff moving around. And this actually, with the whole idea of human pathogens moving around, maybe we can actually get back to what people have been talking about for decades, is the fact that we can move plant pathogens and pass around very readily through these routes of commerce. And politically, there hasn't been much will to do anything about that. But when you can see the devastation that it can occur and how disruptive it is, maybe it makes a little sense to step back and say, okay, well, we know what it does to human populations. What is it doing to our plant populations? Can we take the reasonable safeguards that it takes to act and put those in place so that we aren't moving these pathogens and pests around willy-nilly globally? So I think there's a chance for a slight reset here if people will you know, press the political part of it, which is it takes some political will to say, oh yeah, we can't just allow raw materials to be moving back and forth. Otherwise, we're going to continue to see more and more stuff out there. And one of the problems I have with some very well-intentioned types of efforts like water conservation, there's this whole effort to replace your lawn with more xeric plants that are water. Where are all these plants coming from? They're all coming from nurseries. So what are we doing? It's Phytophthora-mageddon, really, basically, because without a clean plant supply, all people are doing is just introducing tons of Phytophthora into these landscapes. So in terms of, you know, there are unintended consequences if you don't see things that are hard to see, which are, you know, pathogens are mostly invisible. So I think that we have that issue, and then we couple that with the climate change issue. We just had a study with that we contributed to with Adrian Doss down in the Southern Sierra in Sequoia National Forest. And pretty much they were able to document these higher levels of mortality in blue oak stands that was really associated with the drought and could decouple it from other sorts of effects. And so as we end up with mega droughts or changes in evaporative demand, some of these marginal sites for some of these oak species are going to become intolerable sites. And so we will see things changing. We'll also see potentially sites that maybe had more music oaks, they might be able to take some of these more drought tolerant oaks. So we have to kind of think adaptively in terms of how we manage things, and the landscape can't be frozen into place because everything else is changing around it. So we have to kind of be able to deal with that.
And just a quick add-on for the political part of it, if anyone is interested, one interesting thing to check out is called Tree Smart Trade. If you go to that, if you Google that, you'll find their website. Might be interesting for more information and interest.
Okay. Well, if we're good, I think we can end the webinar now. And I think this was great. Thank you everyone for being here. I think we pulled it off, I hope. We'll see what the video looks like. I don't know if I messed that up, but we'll see how it looks. But I really appreciate everyone's participation, and their questions were great. Like Yana mentioned, we're trying to figure out the best way to kind of address some of these more complicated topics. We'll see what we come up with. But as I mentioned at the beginning, this video will be posted so that you can go back and maybe review this, or if people weren't able to join us, they can see what we talked about.
And Mike, you've posted resources and more information on the page that all of this information is found, correct?
Yep. Where the videos are located, there's at the bottom of the page are links for pretty much everything that was discussed today, and in our talks, there's just a vast amount of information available, and I provided links to websites and other resources where you can find a lot more detailed information. Also, the presenters, if they had specific material they want to include with their talk, it's posted under their video. So there's a lot of information out here, and you can definitely dive into it at your leisure. So again, I want to thank our panelists. I appreciate you all for being here with us and taking time out to present on these issues and have a discussion with our audience. And with that, if there's anything else anybody else wants to say, I will go ahead and end the webinar. So,
Thanks, everybody.
yeah, thank you.
Thank you.